like to talk to you about a couple of things. The first is life in Granite Falls, and then the second will be your time in the service. Okay?
Okay.
Okay. Tell us, first of all, my daddy told me two things. He told me that your daddy drove the train to Edgemont. Is that right?
Yeah, that's true.
What kind of memories do you have of him running the train?
Well, the falling through it up here when it fell through it.
When the train wrecked?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I didn't know about that.
Yeah. He was on the first engine that went through, in other words. He crossed the little bridge, in other words, and the second engine fell in and some cars. There was one person, I think, killed. But outside of that was all there was to it.
Yeah. How far up?
Was
that past one?
Oh,
okay. I did not know about that.
Yeah, it was early in life, in other words. And,
but he wasn't hurt?
No. My mother said when he got home, in other words, she had to hold his cup because he couldn't hold it.
And bless his heart, that could be so scary.
But anyway, that's about the only experience that I had, in other words, with the railroad as far as it goes. In other words, I never actually rode the train as far as it goes.
Okay.
Or anything, but outside of that, about any place that he ever went, I went with him.
Oh, did you? You
Yes.
traveled a lot with him?
And yes, and I remember a lot of things that happened around here at that time. We're talking about 38.
Okay.
That's when he had the house rewired. In other words, he didn't have but 110 in here when we moved in. He bought this place in 1927, the year I was born.
Oh.
And what he bought was this section here and this the kitchen that they had out on there and part of a porch. And the rest of it has been added. He added this from 27 to 1930 when we moved in here.
Okay.
And this was the old schoolhouse that used to sit out here on the highway where Walmart is.
Really?
Yes.
I did not know that.
Yes, it was. It was one of the first. And
yeah, did you go to
Winklers,
school?
No.
You wouldn't have.
The Winklers bought this in 1932 and moved it from the road out to here with mules and logs.
Wow.
And when this road went through here, in other words, it was actually the first highway that went from Hickory to Lenore.
Okay.
It came down this road here, went down to the river, crossed the creek down there.
Yeah.
The old Granite Depot used to sit down on the river down there where that trestle was they built going into Roadhouse. And the house that was up on the hill up there, which is still, I think, maybe the foundation around there, but the trees have grown up through it, is still down there, in other words. He was the guy that worked the depot.
I did not know any of that.
Well,
it's very interesting.
And the cliffs, which they call the cliffs, was over here at Longview, back at the airport there. That's where they put water and coal and stuff in the engines, in other words. And my grandfather, on my dad's side, he lived down on the river where my dad was raised, down below where Lloyd Keller's house is. And he used to walk to Hickory, in other words, and one Saturday he went to Hickory and he liked to nip a little bit, according to what I understand. And they don't know whether he fell and went to sleep or just went to sleep or whatever, but anyway, the train run over him down there at where the cliffs were. I don't remember him, in other words. I just remember my dad and them talking about it. But anyway, we moved into this house when I was 3 years old. And the spring was about 3/4 of a mile down the hill here that we had spring box and stuff that I had to get up in the mornings at 4 o'clock build a fire and wood stove, go out, milk the cows, feed the hogs, feed the horses, feed the cows, whatever, carrying wood, carry water, 2 buckets that I couldn't hardly get off the ground coming up the hill and whatever, and then catch the bus and go to school. If I missed the bus, it was a walk. And I walked many a morning for the simple reason that I'd lay around, in other words, and just purposely missed the bus, hoping that he'd say, well, you could stay home today, but it never did happen.
So where did you go to school?
I went to school at the middle school, or the grammar school at Granite Falls. It
The
was
big
one
old
that, yeah,
school
the old
across
one that
from
used
the
to sit over where across from where the hardware, the
drugstore?
drugstore is.
Yes. Okay.
And I never could understand why they condemned it, in other words, because there was only kids in it. They said it wasn't safe for them, but then after they closed it, Shiford Mill stored cotton in there, which a bale of cotton weighs close to a ton.
Yeah.
And it never did make sense to me why they done it, but anyway, they did.
Well, I wish they hadn't torn it down also. It would be a wonderful place.
I started the school, I don't know what year I started. I was 4th or 5th year, I don't remember, but I went to the first year, in other words, and they promoted me from the 1st to the 3rd grade. And so I went through that, in other words, I went to the 7th grade in the grammar school. And then they had the high school up there where the middle school is now.
And you started 8th grade up there?
Yeah, and I went through the 11th. They had 11th the last year that I went. In other words, we had the last year, 11 was 11 years. I graduated in 42.
And you were how old?
15. And I talked my dad into signing a paper that I was 17 years old, and I went in the service. But he told me, he said, don't call and say you want out, because I'll swear on my dying bed that you're old enough. Well, I didn't really have a choice, because, like I said, I joined in August, and the 1st of 43, I was in the South Pacific.
Okay. Where did you go to boot camp?
Bainbridge, Maryland.
Okay. What was your job in the Navy?
I was a boatswain mate.
Okay.
Actually, I was a coxswain. In other words, I run the boat. In other words, that the captain, when we go into the islands, in other words, to the bays and whatever, I'd take him ashore or take him wherever he wanted to go and go get him and whatever. And it was sort of a privilege to one extent, in other words. But we was on a small ship. It was 340 some feet long and 47 foot wide. And the yard arm was 90 feet off of the water line.
And what kind of a ship was it? Was it a...
It was a destroyer escort.
That would be the size.
And, but anyway, we went through Panama Canal, and the next morning he came up and said that we was going to it was going to be in the South Pacific, and we was be there till it was over. And I spent 2.5 years over there, starting at Guadalcanal and hitting islands, in other words, putting troops on islands, in other words, all the way up to Iwo Jima.
And you transported troops. Were you out on the shore
Well,
on any of those
no,
islands?
what we done, in other words, our job was escorting them for subs, in other words, mostly for subs and aircraft or whatever. But when we'd go to the invasions, we would go as close to the beach as we could get, in other words, and we would have the troop ships would be behind, out from us, unloading, you see. And they wouldn't come in until they got all of the troops unloaded, in other words, into the boats and ready to come in other words. And then they would send one wave in. And what we would do is we would strafe the beaches, in other words, to keep the Japs off the beaches. And you had the other ships out further, bombing them in other words, shooting them into the back of the island and stuff, in other words, to knock out what they could. And our job was to go up and down. We had maybe about a mile that we would go, and then we would turn and come back. But we would lay on the decks, in other words, with 50 caliber machine guns. And of course, they had 20 millimeters and 40 millimeter guns that would strafe the beach, in other words, to keep the Japs off. And when the troops would come in, if we needed to, we'd lay smoke screens or whatever, but 90% of the time we didn't have to. But anyway, we'd land the troops and stuff, in other words, and then when it was over with, we'd go back, in other words, take the empty ships back, escort them back. They'd reload the ships, in other words, with troops, and we'd go hit another island. And it was that way all the way through till the end of the war. And like I said, we would take the islands. In other words, what we would do is take one island, we'd skip one, take another one, we'd skip another one. In other words, we'd isolate them.
Okay.
And we'd just leave them go, you see, until after the war. In other words, they cleaned the islands off and whatever. But like I said, but we started putting the convoy together for the Philippines in I guess it took about 6 months to put it together. We started at Guam. Most of the stuff was put together at Guam, and then it was put to sea. And for 6 months, we more or less was at sea with ships, keeping them in line and in the positions they're supposed to be. In other words, that would be troop ships, supply ships, whatever. And then, like I say, when we get to the islands, in other words, we would go in close. The troop ships would be next, and then the bigger ships would be on the outsides. Going, in other words, shooting inside the island and whatever.
Were you on the same ship for the
I
entire
was on
time?
the same ship.
Oh my goodness. And all of the people did you keep like the same officers, or do you know?
Well, we had changes in officers and also in personnel, but it wasn't that often. But we had on our ship, in other words, there was 7 ships in our group. And in that 7 ships, in other words, you had a commodore. He would stay on certain ships for certain lengths of time. And 90% of the time he stayed on our ship. For what reason, I don't know, but he did. And when we would go into ports, in other words, we had 2 full commanders on the ship. The Commodore was a full commander, and the captain was a full commander. And usually on a destroyer escort, you don't have that kind of officers. We even had warrant officers on it that the other ships didn't have. But we sort of was treated a little better than what the rest of the ships were because we had these officers on there.
That was nice.
Well, but that's what I'm saying. We was there, and like I said, we escorted a lot of ships, and we'd also pick up a lot of aircraft pilots, in other words, that would crash or whatever, or get shot down. In other words, we'd go out and pick them up and bring them in.
Did you ever have any Japanese prisoners of war on your ship?
No. But we did pick up survivors, and there was one in particular that we had to pick up that he come down from, I don't know how high he was, but he was pretty well up there. But when we picked him up, you couldn't lift him. You had to we put him on a tarp and lifted him because I think every bone in his body was broke. But we took him, we had to call in. We was on one side of the island, and the bay that went between these 2 islands was mined. And we had to have a pilot fly out from the base, in other words, to where we was at, and get on the ship to take us through that island, in other words, bay between the 2 islands, in other words, so we wouldn't hit the mines. And we took him in other words, and he lived 2 days after we picked him up. But we had went back through, in other words, and went on, caught up with the other convoy and went on to wherever we were going. But they kept us informed of his lifetime, in other words, and finally, like I say, the morning of the 3rd day, they called us and sent a message that he had passed away.
Oh my goodness.
But like I say, we had picked up a lot of people, in other words, especially in the Philippines, when they went into the invasion of the Philippines.
Wow.
And
how long I should maybe remember this. How long was the invasion of the Philippines going
Well,
on? The second
I don't
round?
really know how long it lasted as far as it goes, but I would say probably the main part of the fighting was probably about 60 days.
Okay.
And that's before that we went and got MacArthur in New Guinea, in other words, and took him up there with his corncob pipe so he could walk ashore and say, "I've returned."
Did you see MacArthur?
Yes, I did.
Oh, wow.
But we got 50 messages that said, "Sink the ship before it gets here." Because the Navy didn't like MacArthur.
He didn't like MacArthur at all, no.
Well, he didn't do nothing, but he got credit for the war, but he didn't do nothing. Nimitz and Halsey and a couple other admirals that was out there as won the Pacific War. But he got the privilege of walking ashore on the Philippines. Of course, he said he would return. But it was just one of them things that happens, you know.
And a legend is born. So
Yes,
that's what it was about.
But like I say, the invasion, probably the biggest part of the fighting and stuff was over in about 60 days. But when we went in there, we had the awfully smell, and we didn't know what it was until it got daylights, and we figured it out. It was bodies in the bay.
How sad.
And they were going through with sweepers. In other words, they had minesweepers, and they was using their nets to pick up the bodies and stuff. And what they done with them, I don't know, but that's the way it was.
Did your ship take fire?
We got a torpedo hit, in other words, but it didn't explode. It went through the bow and didn't explode.
You're very fortunate.
We were relieved from duty, in other words, went into shore, in other words, and we didn't spend but about 4 hours in there. They took the torpedo out, and the ship that relieved us got sunk.
No.
And we went back and took our position back up again and stayed there for another 30 days. And towards the end of the fighting in there, we went to the Aleutians and picked up a hospital ship that was about 400 and some feet long, and it was a big one because they needed it in the Philippines, in other words, because they had all the hospitals full. Right. And after the Philippines, in other words, we was going into Iwo. That's when we hit the typhoon out there. We was in it for 48 hours.
Oh my goodness, how awful was that?
Well, we was 48 miles back from where we were when we hit it, when it ended. And we escorted the carrier, one of the carriers back to the Hawaii, that the bow on it was as flat as that wall.
Really?
But we was in it for about 48 hours.
I just can't imagine.
Well, it's
a hurricane on the ocean in a boat.
Well, we were walking, in other words, your passageways in the ship is usually about 3 foot wide. And we were actually walking on the bottom of the bulkhead on the one side, in other words.
Really?
That's how much it would tilt.
Tilt and list. Oh my goodness.
But people asked you about it, and through the things that you do and things, they asked you what did you do and stuff, and after the first 2 or 3 times, it become a job.
Yes.
It was just like getting up, going to work. And
well, I think that's how your generation responded. This was your job, and this is what you did.
yes.
And there was no big deal to be made about it.
No.
Although
No.
we know it really was a big deal, but you just
Well,
were the
if
people
we
that
hadn't
didn't
have done
see it.
if we hadn't have done what we done, we'd either be talking Japanese or German.
That's right.
And I'll admit this, we're the forgotten group.
In many ways.
The government paid for North Korea and Vietnam, but for us, we paid for our own.
That's true. You did.
And we still got the best one up there.
Yeah. Now, what was the name of your ship?
USS Lozier, Loeser,
Okay.
DE 680.
Let me write that down. I will remember that. but only because I wrote it down. That is also interesting. So, where were you when you heard about VE Day?
I was in Pearl Harbor.
Were you?
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Okay.
We had brought the carrier back in there
Mm-hmm.
because you see, we was going into EWO when the war ended in Germany.
Were you? I have seen film of this huge celebration in Hawaii. Do you remember any of that? Did you see it?
Well,
Now you're a sailor. Be honest.
let
Okay.
me tell you, I'll be honest with you. Everybody said I had a good time, but I don't really know.
Oh, hey, you must have then.
Well, everything was closed except food stores and stuff.
Sure.
The bars was closed and things because it was on a Sunday.
Okay.
And 4 of us got a cab and went on the backside of Hawaii where we wasn't supposed to be, and we got some bootleg whiskey. And we went to one of these pantry stores over there, and we called them party packs back them days. In other words, that was the big bottles. And we got 4 bottles of party pack, and we found a big old tree and a little pond in a graveyard. And we had a party.
I love it. And the neighbors didn't complain.
Well, we didn't know. They didn't
No,
complain.
they.
But the last thing I remember, it was bullfrog jumping in the pool.
That is great.
I woke
That is
up the
great.
next morning. I got up and my clothes was under my bunk like it's supposed to be, folded up, in other words. And I asked everybody how I got back. And they said, well, you was the only one that could get on the boat. You wouldn't let nobody else on the boat.
I love it. That is a great memory.
And
That
so
is
I said to myself at that time, everybody said we had a good time, but I don't remember too much of it. And I made a appointment with myself not to do it again. And
There
I
you
didn't.
go.
But anyway, that was the story of Pearl Harbor and VE
I
Day.
love it. Well, did you see?
And I got this tattoo on my arm here.
Do you remember getting the tattoo?
Oh yeah,
Okay, good.
that was
That's-
before all of
that's
this
important.
happened. Because that's when we found out everything was closed and we was finding something to do. And
You got inked.
there was 4 of us got this same tattoo, and I'm the only one left that's got it.
Really?
Yes. So
Did you keep in touch with any of your?
Yes, I do.
shipmates?
As a matter of fact, I talked to a feller, 2 of them, last week. One's in California. He's 92 years old. Was married 50 years with his wife.
Oh my goodness.
And he's a good friend. Was on the ship with us. And the other one is in Phoenix, Arizona. He's married and he's now in assisted living, but and then there's another one that's in Denver, Colorado, that I keep in touch with, and that's about it.
Oh, we
But
should all get
I
together.
went to reunions for years. You see, after the ship, we came back from the war. They converted the ship over from the 3-inch. We had 3-inch guns on it when we went in the Pacific during the war.
Mm-hmm.
But when the war was over, we came back to San Francisco, and they gave us leave. And when leave was over, we reported back to San Francisco. We stayed in barracks, and they converted the ship over. They put 5-inch guns on it and updated it, in other words. And we had steam turbine, in other words, instead of diesel engines. There's a lot of the DEs that was out there was powered by diesel engines. They stunk.
Oh yeah.
And I mean, if you get around a diesel car, in other words, you know how they smell.
You know how they smell. My daddy's a truck driver.
And so anyway, we were fortunate. I think that's why that Commodore stayed on our ship longer than it did on others. But I don't know. But anyway, that's what we had, in other words, and they converted us over, in other words, and I had to either get out of the service because I had enough time to get out, see, because I'd spent 2.5 years, see, in the South Pacific, well, in the Pacific, it's North Pacific, South Pacific, China Sea, all of them as far as it goes. But anyway, I spent 2.5 years over there before we came back into the States.
So where were you on VJ Day?
in Midway.
And was there a huge celebration there?
Not really. We wasn't on the beach or anything.
Okay.
We was on. Actually, we was out patrolling around that there before the VE Day or VJ Day. But anyway, that night we picked up that sub that stayed in the Tokyo Bay for so long of giving out information.
Wow.
And they didn't have the code or anything. And when we picked them up, in other words, we fired star shells over the top of them, which a star shell is one that lights up.
Mm-hmm.
And I think every sheet they had on there that was out there holding the sheet up, letting them know that.
Please don't shoot anymore.
Yeah. But anyway, we wired in to what it was, and we had to stay out there with them the rest of the night. In other words, and at 8 o'clock that next morning, we took them in to the bay, there to the harbor. And when they tied up to the pier, there was 5 tankers of milk sitting on the pier.
Okay. That is also interesting. That's great. And you lost friends.
Mm-hmm.
Of course. And it's
Mhm.
hard. It's got to be terrible. You know, I can't, those of us who've never been in the military, I don't think we can quite understand the bond that happens when you go through all that.
You become a family.
Yes.
You know everybody by first name. And everybody wore the same thing. I mean, you know, no
Yes.
officers from enlisted personnel outside of dog tags and things like
Mhm.
that. But like I say, you become a family. And my kids always said, well, where did you go? And people ask me, where did you go? I said, well, 347 feet this way and 47 feet this way. And they look at you and I say, I just haven't learned to walk on water yet.
Really? Because you didn't spend much time on shore.
No. And I used to go to places and give blood.
Mm-hmm.
Because back in them days you didn't have the plasma and stuff.
Right.
But you went to the hospitals and you laid there beside them for 3 days giving blood.
Wow.
And you had opportunities to go on different ships, in other words, because sometimes they'd put you on one to get you back to where your ship was at.
Right.
And so you made friends on other ships as well and stuff and whatever. And of course you got 2 weeks of R&R after you give blood, you see, and builds your system back up, and they'd put you on some island, in other words, and it was secured, and
Mm-hmm.
you didn't do nothing except eat and sleep.
Wow. That is so interesting. I've never heard any of these stories.
Well, and
Thank you.
like in Guam, for example, in other words, it was one of the bigger islands, in other words, and they had the hospitals there, and they had the waves, which were nurses. And in order to have a date, you had to get you a 45 and you had to get a Jeep. And in order to get this, you had to go to the beach, and in other words, the Marine sergeant that was in charge of all of this, in other words, you gave him a carton of cigarettes or either a box of Mr. Goodbars.
Oh.
And you got a gun and you got a Jeep.
Okay.
And then you and your date went on picnic. But you had others with you.
Sure.
You couldn't be out alone, in other words, or just didn't go with 3 people. Because at that time, there wasn't inhabitants outside of natives.
Mm-hmm.
And today, they're all resorts.
Yes, of course. And they don't remember what really went on there.
Well, no, they didn't. But like I say, the only island that's not inhabited is the one that they exploded the first atomic bomb on.
Is that Bikini Island? I believe that's
Mhm.
Bikini Islands. So were you with the same destroyer group throughout the Navy, throughout the time in service?
Well, we operated with not the same. Well, when we first went out there, the tourist ships that they had at that time become troop transports.
Right.
And we operated with them until they built other ones, in other words, because there was a lot of ships built, you see, doing
Mhm.
that, in other words, in a fantastic short length of time.
The Liberty ships were just thrown together in a few
They
days,
were,
literally.
but they served their purpose.
Mhm.
And like I say, the aircraft carriers, there was a lot of them, you see, that was, these bigger ships was converted over, put flat decks on them. In other words, for aircraft to land on and stuff. And how them planes ever landed and got off of some of them, it's hard to believe.
It is very hard to believe because the deck was not big enough, really.
Well, you had these catapults that they called them.
Yes.
They were spring things that you pulled them back, in other words, and
shot them off like
shot them off.
Yeah.
And they used gas and stuff to fuse it or whatever. It was sort of like missiles.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's how they were. They were basically missiles.
Yeah. And of course, the bigger ships, after they got the helicopters and stuff, they got helicopters that land on them. They had places built on them. In other words, round places that they could light on and stuff and like that. But like I said, there was you met a lot of people, and in other words, and you never met a bad person. If you did, they got rid of it. Mm-hmm. In other words, they told you when you went aboard the ship, in other words, that you don't touch nobody, nobody touches you. And you don't make fun of nobody. And like I say, if people made fun of you, whatever, they was usually took care of.
Mm-hmm. Well, there had to be an environment where you did become that family, so you could work together.
Yeah. Well, like I said, I was 15 years old when I went over there. I turned 16 in the South Pacific.
So you were still a teenager when the war was over?
No.
No?
Well, yeah, in a way.
Yeah. So you
45.
went in, right. Mm-hmm. So you went in what year?
42.
42. Okay.
18.
Yeah.
But if it had to be done, I'd do it again.
Well, and I admire that because that's what your generation says we'd do it again. I'm not sure we have a generation that would give what y'all gave.
It's not the same.
It's not the same. How do you feel? Tell me your feelings about the war.
Well, it's sort of like if you've seen the movie of Saving Private Ryan, if you've seen the scene of Normandy, the invasion of Normandy, that's what I've seen for approximately 2 years. And it was just something that we had to do, and there was no way of getting around it.
Well, I'm sure that you hated the fact that you were taking all these young men, and so many of them were going to die.
Yeah, well.
And that's sad.
Yeah. And you've seen a lot of them that died in ways that you felt like it shouldn't have happened, but that was the way life was in the war. And I'll say this, in other words, when we went through boot camp, they give the procedures of what happens when you get into war and stuff, in other words, and about this business of hollering halt. Mm-hmm. They teach you that. But they took us into a special room after we graduated, and they give us an orientation, and the first thing they said to us is, we want to explain this halt situation. And one of them spoke up and said, well, it's what about it? He said, well, I want to tell you something. He said, when you're standing there hollering halt, what's the other guy doing?
Shooting at you.
And he said, what you do is you shoot and then you holler halt.
Yeah.
And if it's the wrong person, then he was at the wrong place at the wrong time. And he says it's something that you'll have to accept.
And that has to mark you in some way.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
It does.
But that's where I come back to saying that after you go through it for a little while, it becomes a job. Mm-hmm. You do what you have to do.
It's very sad.
And when it goes into some of these places, it's what you call self-survival.
Mm-hmm. And that's what, it's what had to happen for us to win.
Yes.
And we didn't start it, so.
But you see, there was a lot of people that got hurt, that got saved, in other words, that came back that didn't get saved. Mm-hmm. In which they was probably cases that it couldn't be helped. It's just like us when you put people on the beach. In other words, that was your last experience with them.
Right. You were never going to see those
you
people
wished them
again.
well, but like I say, you know that there was going to be a lot of them not coming back. And it's just like yourself, in other words. I mean, these kamikaze planes, they're coming at you. And it's everybody's self-survival.
So, when did you actually get out of the Navy?
I got out in November the 16th, I think it was, or November. It was in November of 47.
47. Okay.
When I got out.
After the war was over, what were you doing officially?
Well, I was still doing the capacity that I done. In other words, I was still coxswain. I took the captain where he needed to go and stuff with the whaleboat and whatever. And doing deck, in other words, I was considered a deck crew. In other words, I stood watches. In other words, and after the war, instead of having 2 on and 2 off, or 4 on, 4 off, you'd have maybe a 8 hours watch, you see, or something, and then you'd be off for a week and then have it again or whatever. But you didn't have all the watches that you had when you had the war. In other words, and that was like in subs, for example, when a lot of people don't realize it, but in the subs when I was in the Navy, in other words, you shared bunks. Yeah. Because when you was on duty, there was somebody else slept in your bunk. And when you got off, he had to watch, and you slept in your bunk, you see. But like I said, you shared bunks in there, but you didn't on the ships.
Right.
See, we had enough bunks on the ship, in other words, that we had it. And we did have 4 blacks on the ship that I was on. They was on there when I went on. In other words, they went on the same time I did, and a lot of them stayed on there. I don't think there was anybody stayed on it as long as I did, because I put it in commission and I put it out of commission, which they consider me a plank owner, in other words, because I was put it in commission, I put it out of commission. Of course, the ship was commissioned 2 more times after that. It was commissioned again. It was put in the Naval Reserve Fleet or whatever, and it was commissioned again in the 50s, in other words, for the Vietnam crisis. And then when the Cuban crisis was in the 60s, it was commissioned again. And in the meantime, when it was in the Naval Reserve, it was used at Annapolis to put students on it to go out to learn navigation and stuff, to get the actual
so
services.
They didn't just mothball it, they actually kept it in use.
Well, they mothballed it for a while, and then they put it back in use and used it for that purpose. But like I say, it was sunk in the late 60s off of the coast of Florida. And the last skipper was on it, was on the ship that sunk it.
Okay.
But it's a history that a lot of people just don't know much about.
Right, and we're losing it. We're losing about 1,000 World War II veterans a day. And we're losing our history if we don't do what we're doing with you. So,
well, I'm
really
just lucky. I like I said, I let you in on a little other things too, as far as it goes. After we came back, in other words, when they started decommissioning the ships and stuff, they moved us over to Norfolk, in other words, from Panama. And they started bringing the ships back in from England, in other words, when they started returning the ones that we had let them have during the war. And they moved us to New London, Connecticut. And we was across, we tied up at the State Pier at New London, Connecticut, across from the Groton subbase, which is across the river there. And we discharged about all of the people that was on the ship. I think there was 32 of us left. We didn't have enough to get underway and stuff. So we stayed there for about 6 months. And I met my wife. I dated her sister at first, and we went out, and for some reason she parked herself across from me, and I got kicked on the shins. And I went with her 2.5 months, and we got married.
And how old were you then?
20.
Okay.
She was 21.
And you met her in New London,
Mhm.
Connecticut. Okay. And brought her back to Granite Falls.
Yep. Well, she told me after that when she walked through that door, in other words, and seen me, that when I was introduced, she says, "That's the man I'm going to marry." And that's what she did.
That is wonderful. Love it.
But we had 61 years and 9 months.
Mm-hmm. And how many children?
6.
Okay. How many boys?
4.
And 2 girls.
2 girls.
Okay. How many grandchildren do you have?
17.
Do you have great-grandchildren?
15.
Oh, my goodness.
And 7 great-greats.
Really? So tell me about in Granite Falls, what kind of businesses do you remember when you were very small?
Well, when I was little, from 12 years old until I got 15 years old, Granite Falls was a fast hopping city, or a little town, whatever you want to call it. Sunday nights at 12 o'clock, there was more people on the streets in Granite Falls in one night than there is now in probably a week.
Really?
The movie was still going. We had 3 pool rooms. We had 2 good restaurants. We had doctors. I used to go with my brothers up there to shoot pool and stuff, but I sat there. I had sense enough not to go up and say, "I want a beer," because I'd have got my tail slapped and told me to go back and sit down or whatever. But we could go in the pool rooms. And it was going, and like I said, it was a hopping little town. And Dr. Kent's wife
Was the mayor.
when I heard, in other words, she wasn't mayor yet when I left, but I heard that she was going to run, and she was going to clean the town up, and she did. Because it's nothing now. Granite Falls ain't nothing.
Yeah, we don't have the stores. It's easier to get to Hickory or Lenore.
Well, Lenore keeps telling me, you know, you need to come up here. You need to do this. Keep your money in the county. I said, listen, I built my shop out there in '82. I went up there, and they didn't even know where it was. They didn't know where Red Oak Road was. And I told them, I said, "You don't know where it is?" I said, "I ain't going to tell you." And they had those little camp things in there, cow stalls, I called them, where these girls sat, you know, with computers or whatever they were doing. And all of them raised up, and I said, "The only time you people know we live is when tax time is and when you go on election." And that's the way I still feel about it.
Well, I understand. I have heard people say that people in Lenore think the county line is at the patrol station.
That's right. That's right.
And that's sad. Okay, what is a store you really remember going to in Granite? Was there one particular store you
The
remember most?
Winn-Dixie store that was up there.
Yeah.
Used to be there beside the Mackey's.
Yes.
Used to be a front on it. In other words, they built more to it when they changed it over to the grocery store there, in other words. But it's when Dixie started, it was shorter. They added more to it, brought it out to the face of the other stores. And then they finally moved it over to the one that was over
Across from the old
across from
elementary
the
school.
old community schoolhouse.
Do you remember Miss Maddie's dime store?
Mm-hmm.
I just always think about her and how she would lock the doors
Well,
and shake
you had
them.
2 drugstores. You had
Yes.
one Dr. Kent there, and then you had one for Coatnings. And well, like I say, you had 2 good restaurants. Old man Cook that had one of the restaurants. He used to be there beside where the bank was, in that one there. And then there was another one down there, sort of where that one is now. I can't remember who run it. But then they had another one down where the pool room was.
Right.
Down where the movie theater was. And like I said, we used to go up there, like I said, on Sunday night at 12 o'clock when they closed the theater.
So people were in town.
Oh
that
God,
late.
yeah. There was all kinds of people up there.
I love it.
And like you say, right out here where the end of the road is here is what they used to call the Red Oak Honky Tonk. It was one of the hottest ones in the county.
Really?
Well, you had Shanghai over there.
Well, you had Shanghai.
You had Rammer's Inn up at Sawmills.
Mm-hmm.
You had Mimosa over at Valdez. You had Chase and Sanborn down here where Huffman Holder Mill is.
Mm-hmm. And here you had the, what was it?
Red Oak.
Red Oak. Okay.
It was Red Oak Honky Tonk.
And where did it sit?
Right at the end of the road. In other words, where you turn in other words, they got that opening over there.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, the front of this building was right there where that woods is. You can go over to the side of it over there and you can still see the columns that was on the house that was built right beside of where the honky tonk was.
That's interesting.
See, Williams owned it.
Mm-hmm.
They lived across where 321 goes across Dudley Shoals Road there. That house, that brick house that sat right there, you could see it from the highway, from 321 now. It's still there, the house is. But there was a Williams owned it.
Okay.
And his son and him lived out here until they moved up there to that place.
Learned a lot today.
Well, you had Rose Martin, Al Dooley, and one they called Buttermilk from Catawba County used to come out here. And it was honky tonk on Fridays, Saturdays, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But the rest of the week is a grocery store and a little convenience store.
Mm-hmm.
But gas was 12 cents a gallon.
Okay, when do you remember this being open? The Red Oak Honky Tonk. When was it open?
I don't have any idea when it was opened as far as it goes, because like I said, when I was a kid, it had been there a long time.
Okay, but you remember it being open.
Oh yes.
And do you remember when it closed down?
When after I went into service.
Okay. I guess during the war there wasn't enough traffic through to keep things open.
Well, traffic was still there, but the point of it was things developed different.
True.
Like I said, Miss Kent up there took everything away and all of that stuff disintegrated, you see, as far as it goes.
Plus we had rationing and there wasn't
Yeah.
a lot of things to...
Well, you see, when I was little, my dad was the only one down this area had a telephone. And it was one of those that you
Yes, a
crank.
one.
There was only 110 power at this house
Uh-huh.
when we moved in it, in other words. In 38 is when he bought electric stove, water heater and stuff, in other words, and they had to run new power lines in. And the power lines is the same that they was, except for this pole out here to the road. When I built my shop out here, I got 3-phase power from Duke Power,
Mm-hmm.
and they run new lines all the way from the road out to this pole here.
Wow.
For me, and put transformers up there, in other words. And every time you could sit in here and like the lights, for example, every time a pump would come on or somebody would turn a light on, your lights would flicker. And up in the loft of this part here, there's still little porcelains up there with a single strand wire running through it that goes to the lights here. They're not there now, but they're still up there on the rafters.
Yeah.
In 1938 is when he done all this redoing, in other words, and they run power into here. And my dad had the first television. We used to sit on the steps over there. It used to be open. The steps used to go up right there and then went up. But they used to, I turned them around and put them to come in from the front door, in other words, because it didn't have no closets in here. And I put a closet in that room, and I built one in that bedroom that my dad built in 48. And that's the way I found out that that we could put closets.
Right.
Is we turned that steps around, and me and my wife fought for 3 months over the steps in there. But there wasn't no way I could put another step if another place. See, it used to go up a step here.
Sure.
Then it went up. Well, when you turn the steps around, you couldn't have that. And so your steps got steeper.
Yes.
And
We
I just never did really leave it down after, but that was the only way we could go, and we finally settled for it.
I love it. So when you brought your wife back here after the war, did you live in this house then, or
No.
you had your own place?
See, my dad was still living at the time, in other words, and he died in 57. My mother died in 65. And she first come down here, she was what they call the damn Yankees.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
She couldn't understand the people, and she couldn't understand this red mud and stuff, in other words, but she fell in love with my dad, in other words. And but like I say, we came down here the first time, and I think it was 48. And one of my sons was born down here. And the rest of them was born up there, except for Lisa. She was born down here. But she came down, in other words, and stayed with my dad and my mom. And she couldn't understand the people, in which I could accept it. And after we got married, in other words, then we moved down here. And to be honest with you, I went and got her 9 times in 3 months. But her dad was a big influence on her marriage. He didn't care for me, and neither did his wife as far as it goes, because I was a Southerner.
Mm-hmm.
And even the white people up there didn't seem to like me too well until after they learned me, in other words. But like I said, when you first was there, they sort of stayed away from you, because you was a redneck. You kill them, and that's like nothing about it, you know. And that's the way they felt.
Oh, sure. I'm sure they did.
And so anyway, I finally, the 9th time that I went and got my wife, in other words, I told her, I says, this is the last time I'm coming. I says, I'm taking the kids. You want to go, you can go. If you don't, then you stay. Well, she got in the car and she come home. She got here and I told her, I said, Lil, get you a job. And I says, the best job that I can consider you getting is get a waitress job. Get to know the people. You'll not know them until you get to meet them. And she did. And she got a job at the Hotel Hickory, when the Hotel Hickory was still over here. She got a job there. She met all of the lawyers, all the doctors, all the preachers and everything. And she learned these people. And when she died, you couldn't get her to go back north.
That's good that she fell in love with
like I
this
said,
place.
we went together 2.5 months and 61 years, 9 months together.
That's wonderful.
Well, the Lord's been good to me.
Yes. Oh, tell us about Rambler's Inn. Excuse me.
Well, it was a 2-story building. In other words, the bottom part of it was the honky-tonk place, and on a weekend. But during the week, it was just an ordinary grocery store, a little convenience store for the community and whatever. And it was all family owned. And it was just ways for people making a living. And giving other people choices of some of the things that they like to do. And
did they sell like tax-paid whiskey as well as moonshine?
No. It was mostly basically because the whole state was dry. It was homebrew beer. It was homemade stuff, in other words, and it was way of life. I mean, people made fortunes out of it years ago.
Yes,
and it's some of the people that you don't think about anymore. I mean, I could name you several names that's prominent.
But they gained a veneer of respectability later on down the road.
But like I said, it was a way of life back in there. In other words, some women like to get out and party and have a big time, and just same as men and whatever. And they'd get together on the weekend and get in there and kick their heels up. And I mean, you never seen such hopping and jumping. I mean, a little 12-year-old, 10-year-old kid out there looking through the window, peeping at them.
So they just regular working people, and they just came in to blow off steam on the weekend.
They just turned it loose on the weekend, in other words. I mean, it was their outlets. And,
well, that's one of those places you always hear about, and you don't really necessarily hear details about, like what you're telling us.
Yeah.
Well, we've talked for a long time, and we are about to wrap up. Tell me if there is something that I have forgotten to ask you, or that you would just like to add about Granite Falls or your time in service.
Well, I guess probably the time in service maybe one. Mm-hmm. In other words, of enjoying the days like VE Day and VJ mm-hmm. Day, and knowing the satisfaction that we accomplished what we intended to do.
You saved the world.
Well,
yes. Take credit for that. You did it.
I guess so.
And I know you miss friends you left behind there.
Yep.
We really appreciate you taking time to talk to us and tell us your wonderful stories. We've gotten great stuff from you. So.
Well, I don't know.
Oh no, we have, and
lots
people will treasure it.
Lots of things I could probably think about that I should have said. And
well, we can always do that another day.
I know. But like I say, I see these others advertising, in other words, doing it and stuff, and sometimes I don't agree with a lot of them. It's mm-hmm. saying things about certain things, in other words, because do the same thing that they did, but it was different to me than it was to them.
Sure.
But I'm proud of what I've done in my lifetime as far as it goes.
Well, we are too.
And I'll put it this way, if it had to be done again, I'd do it.
We really appreciate you taking time to talk to us and your service to our country. We would not be here without your generation and their sacrifices.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Thank you.